I was preparing for a rather intense conversation with my parents, during which I planned to tell them that I have quit my prestigious job as a corporate consultant, moved out of my overpriced apartment, and I'm now living in my friend's bedroom while spending my days making videos on YouTube. Now, I have one of the most stereotypical East Asian parents, so one can imagine how they would react to such news coming out of their only child's mouth.
Dad, I was actually thinking of becoming a YouTuber.
While I was understandably stressed out, I was struggling to explain to my Canadian friends why I was so stressed out. For some reason, I couldn't seem to help them understand the urgency of my existential crisis. For example, my friends would say, "Just go tell your parents then. What's the big deal? In fact, don't even tell your parents. Why do you have to tell them? You didn't do anything wrong, and it's your life." And I thought, yeah, word. And why am I feeling guilty about this? It's not like I killed anyone or stole anything. I didn't hurt anybody. I just quit my job because I hated my job as an adult in a free country. So why am I feeling this implicit guilt underneath my anxiety? Right? Where does that come from? Now, I think what happened there was that the conversation with my friends had temporarily suspended my Eastern cultural programming. So for a moment, I was only considering my situation from a Western perspective, and indeed from the perspective of a culture that is more individualistic, that believes in independent adults making their own decisions in free societies. My circumstances can seem benign, but the moment my Eastern cultural operating system went back online, it became immediately obvious why I was feeling guilty. The reason was that my action had violated a fundamental principle in my culture, a principle that is deeply valued in many East and Southeast Asian societies. This principle is called filial piety, or xiao in Mandarin Chinese. It's an idea rooted in Confucian philosophy, and it refers to the respect, loyalty, and duty that children owe to their parents and ancestors. In practice, this means things like obeying your parents, honoring their wishes, and caring for them in their old age. But it also goes beyond day-to-day activities. For example, children are expected to consult their parents before making major life decisions, such as those concerning their career. The idea is that the parents, having sacrificed so much for their children's success, have the wisdom and authority to guide them towards the right path. And the right path just so happens to always be doctors, lawyers, or engineers for some reason.
Right? I know because my parents were the same way. They just wanted us to be doctors. It's like this obsession. They just wanted us to be doctors.
But the main point is that it's more than just showing love and respect to your parents. It's a set of fundamental moral obligations that kids are taught to follow from a young age. So when I decided on my own that being a burnt-out corporate consultant was not working for me, made plans to transition my career, and executed those plans without having talked to my parents first and acquired their permission beforehand, I had effectively violated filial piety on a rather fundamental level. And the guilt I felt was a result of that transgression. Now, filial piety as an idea is not inherently problematic. In fact, it seems rather obvious to me that we should feel grateful for our parents. And in principle, ingraining that idea at the foundation of a culture can have many benefits, such as strengthening family bonds, improving social stability, and serving as a seed to other moral virtues like humility, respect, and empathy, just to name a few. However, in practice, filial piety can go too far. And when it does, there can be negative consequences. I intend to explore that in this video, but before I get there, I want to be very precise about exactly what kind of filial piety I have problems with. To do that, I'm going to borrow a concept from academic research called the dual filial piety model, proposed by psychologists Kwang Hui-Ye and Owen Belfort in their research from 2003. This model puts the modern filial piety practices into two categories: reciprocal filial piety and authoritarian filial piety. Reciprocal filial piety is based on mutual respect and affection. It's when children care for and respect their elders out of genuine gratitude and love. often voluntarily and with a sense of personal fulfillment. Authoritarian filial piety, on the other hand, is rooted in strict obedience and duty. It's when children comply with their parents' wishes because they feel obligated to, often prioritizing parental authority over their own desires. Now, I have no problems with reciprocal filial piety. It pretty much sounds like a description of a healthy relationship with one's parents. I would, in fact, encourage everyone to practice this regardless of their cultural background. But I do have some problems with certain implementation of authoritarian filial piety because when taken too far, it can create harmful dynamics for both the kids and the parents. For example, it can be bad for kids' mental health, especially when paired with high parental expectations. In this research by Jerem Lee and Suan Kang, the author noted, quote, due to filial piety, adolescents and emerging adults in East Asia tend to become vulnerable to negative emotions if they cannot fulfill their parents' expectations, which are often very high, end quote. Yes, become a doctor. Now, we probably don't need academic research to tell us that the high pressure from parents in the cultural context of authoritarian filial piety is not optimal for kids' emotional well-being, but in addition to that, it can also impact kids' development. For example, in this research by Kwang Hui Ye, the author found that authoritarian filial piety can inhibit the development of what's called individuating autonomy. In the context of this research, individuating autonomy refers to adolescents' ability to develop distinct sense of self, make personal decisions, and take responsibility for those decisions independently. This dynamic is mentioned again in later research, such as this one by Sun and colleagues in 2019, quote, authoritarian filial piety may inhibit children's self-expression, self-mastery, and individuality, end quote. This could be because when a child makes a decision based on their parents' expectation, they're not really the one making the decision. Their parents are. Whatever the result of that decision may be, good or bad, the responsibility won't ultimately fall onto the child. Rather, it falls onto the parents. This dynamics keeps the kids in a state of dependence because they never have opportunities to experience what it's like to own their decision and learn from their consequences, which in turn can keep the kids from ultimately maturing into fully independent adults. For example, personally, it took me way longer than necessary to quit my corporate consulting job. Now, obviously, there can be many reasons why one can't simply walk away from one's job. There can be financial reasons, logistical reasons, emotional reasons. Many of these reasons apply to me. For example, previously I talked about how simply submitting my resignation was a challenge because I was afraid to inconvenience my company and my project team. But ultimately, this whole exercise of having to make and own a decision of this magnitude all by myself was fundamentally foreign to me. Because growing up, I was used to doing what I was told. I went to the university my parents liked, studied the major my parents liked, and worked the job my parents liked. Now, I wasn't always happy, but it was psychologically comforting. Because even if I hated my life at times, I could always just blame my parents at the end of the day. Even though I was the only one experiencing the suffering from my circumstances, since I was not the one that made the decision that caused them, I was not ultimately responsible. And I liked how I could always conceptually attribute the cause of my problems to someone else. Now, if I were to quit my job and pursue my own journey, the consequences of such decision would fall solely on me. There would be no one else to blame. And that was not something I was used to. So it took me a while to come to terms with that and find the internal alignment to finally execute the decision to quit my job. But kids aren't the only one hurt by this. It can affect the parents as well. Because if the kids never mature into independent adults, the parents would never finish their job as parents either. This means that the parent need to, on some level, own the important decisions in their kid's life forever, which can be exhausting. A more subtle pathology related to the devouring mother can also occur here. The devouring mother is an archetype created by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. It refers to a parent who, often unconsciously, keeps their child dependent on them to avoid the pain of separation or losing control. Instead of encouraging independence, the parents cling to their role as caretaker, using their child's reliance as a way to fulfill their own emotional needs, thereby creating a codependent dynamic. This could happen because the parents might have their own unfulfilled aspirations and are trying to project them onto the child. For example, you could imagine that the parents might actually want to become doctors themselves, but they couldn't, either because they couldn't afford the education or because they didn't have the time because they needed to work multiple jobs to support their family. So they're now trying to force their kids to become doctors so that they can project their unfulfilled dreams onto their kids and live vicariously through their children's achievements. Another reason for the devouring mother is that by focusing excessively on their child, the parents can avoid addressing the issues in their own lives, where the child becomes the convenient project that the parents focus on instead of their own problems. Now, I'm not saying all Asian parents are devouring mothers. The scenarios I mentioned remain as rather extreme possibilities of what can go wrong. But in the cultural context of authoritarian filial piety, while the kids and the parents might remain in this kind of codependent relationships, both parties could feel that they are bound by tradition and are doing what they are supposed to do. For instance, the kids might perceive their parents' control over their lives as, quote, parental effort to give them a better future, or as means of expressing love and attention for their children, end quote. This is again from Jerem Lee and Suan Kang's research. In the same way, the parents might perceive their own effort to manage their children's lives as them fulfilling their parental duties or as a noble self-sacrifice for their children without recognizing how it affects their children's maturation. These cultural dynamics can perpetuate the negative effects we talked about and pave ways to bad outcomes with good intentions, so to speak. So, given these problems with authoritarian filial piety, a natural question to ask is, what's the solution? Now, every parent-child relationship is different. I don't know your situation, and I'm not a relationship therapist, so I can't prescribe specific solution in a professional sense. But I'm going to share what happened between me and my parents, since it serves as a fitting example for this next part of the video. So, I texted my parents the news first. I quit my job and I'm making YouTube videos now and so on. And then I put my phone down and sort of watched it. It started vibrating soon after. Rarely in my life had the vibration of my phone sounded so scary. And sure enough, I was receiving a flurry of texts in the family group chat. My mom was asking, what is YouTube? My dad was saying, you should have a plan. YouTube is too competitive to be a good plan. And after double and triple texting me a few times, my mom just called me. My dad couldn't join the call because he was at work, so it was just me and my mom. So my mom asked me what happened in a concerned and serious, but otherwise calm voice. So I explained the details, how I've been posting content for more than 2 years now and started preparing to go full-time about a year ago, how I have saved up and budgeted my expenses, how I've moved in with a friend to save rent, and how long I think I can last with my savings, and my plan Bs if I run out of money before YouTube becomes sustainable. The whole spiel. So she listened and asked me some follow-up questions about why I made certain decisions and the validity of some of the assumptions I made in my budgeting, for instance. So I answered those questions. I provided the data I had at the time and how I interpreted the data and why I believed my interpretation was reasonable. Just walking her through my logical reasoning, like how one would show one's work on a math homework. So she listened, and at one point she said, oh, well, I don't know that much about YouTube, so I can't help you there, but do you need money? I said no. Then she said, make sure you eat. Don't skip meals just to save money. And then we started talking about nutrition. She was telling me that I should eat a variety of vegetables. And then she started telling me some gossip about my aunt and my cousin. So I was listening to that. It didn't even occur to me that the conversation about my career transition was over. Like we're done talking about it and we're talking about something else now. So after that call, my mom must have told my dad about it. So my dad texted me the next day and said, Louis, you should get Chinese TikTok so you can learn about content creation there. And also you should use music in your videos, etc., etc. So I started texting back. I said, Dad, I'm not sure I can access Chinese TikTok in North America. Also, music is copyrighted on YouTube, blah, blah, blah. And then I realized that we were not revisiting the conversation about my career transition. Like, my dad is making suggestions to me about content creation now. But what about my career transition? Like, are we done talking about that for good? That's it? Just like that? As far as I can tell, my mom seemed to care more that I eat vegetables, and my dad really thought it was important that I include music in my YouTube videos. Neither of them is raising any more objections to my career transition. They seem to have fully accepted it. That was so unexpectedly underwhelming that it's like I was getting ready for an avalanche, but it turns out that it didn't even snow. So I tried to think back to the phone call I had with my mom to figure out what exactly I did that resolved the situation so smoothly, but nothing I did stood out to me. I did remember, though, that at one point my mom said, "Louis, I don't know that much about YouTube, but you sound like you know what you're doing. You've been planning this for a year and have been making content for a while. So I'm not going to worry about this with you anymore. You do you." And she also said, "You sound like you've matured. Seems like you've grown up." And she almost sounded proud. Just to put this in perspective, you're not supposed to be able to make your Asian parents proud. And people make jokes about this, where you can get an A on an exam, but A stands for average for Asian parents. The stereotype is that Asian parents are always in a state of disappointment, regardless of your level of achievement, almost as a strategy to keep you motivated to strive for more. So personally, I have given up on the project of making my parents proud a long time ago. Forget about making them proud. I would have been so happy if my parents could simply understand me for once in my life. And I always thought that I needed to perform some kind of heroic action to achieve that. But there I was, taking content creation suggestions from my dad while trying to convince my mom that I eat vegetables. And not only did they understand me, they seemed to have totally accepted me and might have even been proud of me. And all I did was talking to them. Now, I don't know how this happened, but there are a few possibilities, right? Either aliens captured my parents and swapped their brain, or my parents were like this all along. And all I would have needed to do was to talk to them, right? All I needed was clear and sober human speech this entire time. In other words, I was under the impression that I needed to practice authoritarian filial piety with my parents because of my cultural conditioning. But in reality, they would have been totally fine with reciprocal filial piety. And I didn't know that because I never really talked to them about it. Now, that is only what happened to me. I am one case, and one case isn't statistically relevant. So I set out to look for research that investigates whether what happened to me was part of a wider trend. And it turns out that there was research from as early as 2001 that noted a trend in the way that Asians show respect to their elders. The trend indicates, quote, a move from authoritarian and patriarchal relationships to egalitarian and reciprocal patterns of mutual respect between generations, end quote. That came from this paper by Q Taek-sung. And there is subsequent research since then, such as this paper by Ye and colleagues in 2013, that confirmed a similar trend based on data collected in Hong Kong and Taiwan. A trend where the way filial piety is practiced in modernity is shifting from authoritarian filial piety to its reciprocal counterpart. Now, I was not able to find research that quantifies this shift, that is, how quickly or how much this shift is happening, and how it differs across the different East and Southeast Asian societies. But it's fair to say that there is a shift from authoritarian filial piety to reciprocal filial piety, to some degree, at least in some cultures around the world. And I'm lucky in that my situation with my parents seemed to be a part of that shift. The interesting thing is that I didn't know I was included in that shift until I talked to my parents. So if you're someone like me who is troubled by your parents' expectation, but you never talk to them about it, talking to them seemed like a good first step. And by talking, I don't just mean surface level chit chat, but actually sit down and have a serious but sober conversation. But I fully recognize that not everyone's Asian parents are going to be this chill. In fact, using the word chill in the same sentence as Asian parents sounds somewhat strange to me. For example, there's a movie called Crazy Rich Asians, and the male lead in that movie has a parent who is, spoiler alert, crazy rich. And one of the motifs in that movie revolves around the male lead's struggle to gain acceptance from his parent. His parent wanted him to take over the family business and marry someone who's more strategically optimal to the family network, perhaps, while he himself wanted to charter his own career and marry the woman he loves. And their struggle in an authoritarian filial piety environment looks a lot harder than mine. I mean, it was so difficult that they could make a movie about it. So I fully recognize that there are gradations of difficulties in this game of filial piety, and some of us are dealing with much harder bosses than others, to use a video game analogy. So my strategy of simply talking to my parents and trying to explain my situations calmly with logics may not necessarily be sufficient for everyone. And I certainly don't expect to cure all the parent-child relationship problems across Asia with this one video, but I do hope that this video has helped to provide some clarity to some of these cultural dynamics around parent-child relationships in Asia. And I hope that the awareness that it brings can be useful in some way to those who seek to better their relationships with their parents and or heal from them.